Why is there a growing need for agility? Well, I think there are a number of factors here, not least, of course, is the chaotic state of the market, the levels of uncertainty, unpredictability that we're dealing with, which is then compounded by the fact that the global economy has increasingly moved away from inputs to outcomes. You know, I'm doing a lot of work at the moment with multiple governments around the world around contracting, for example, for social outcomes. You know, when you talk about outcomes, you're talking about a much longer term view. You're talking about much greater levels of uncertainty and unpredictability. So you do, of course, need agile, adaptable methods that maintain focus on the probably changing outcome that is needed in order to deliver the value that was intended. What we actually have today in many corporate circumstances is systems that are designed around control, compliance, and cost reduction, which was appropriate to an input-based world where I was largely buying standardized products, commodity-type services, etc. But actually, as I move to this outcome-based world, those methodologies simply don't work. So let us hear the story of Ugur and BioNTech. This was actually a keynote at one of our academic symposiums back at the end of 2021, when we were looking at the move towards more relational forms of contract. No doubt, of course, agile is precisely that. I also just quickly want to make the point. When I talk about contracts and contracting, they are different. Contracts, we all know, that's one of those boring, unintelligible things that we turn to lawyers to produce. Well, that actually is a fallacy too, because contracts don't have to be long, they don't have to be boring, they don't have to be prepared or produced by lawyers, and increasingly contracts themselves are in fact being designed and developed in far more agile ways and are being designed for users rather than for the court of law. So we also need to challenge some of our prejudices, if you like, and views of what contracts are. But contracts and contracting are quite different. When I talk contracting, I'm talking about the life cycle process from inception of a requirement to closure of the and achievement of whatever the project, program, or deal happened to be. That may or may not involve a formal contract. And the story we're going to hear now is one which did not, at least at its inception, involve a formal contract. So let's listen to Ugur's story about how BioNTech shaped its relationships with Pfizer and Fosun.
Indeed, the question is, how can you generate a contract for such a complex project to develop a vaccine, again, a completely unknown pathogen, where there are no examples. So what we understood is there's no time to make a contract. Contract making requires usually at least 6, usually up to 12 months in the pharmaceutical industry. So we just started with a letter of intention to collaborate. It was a few page document describing in a memorandum of understanding the shared vision, the framework of core principles to direct the collaborations. And the memorandum of understanding explicitly provided flexibility to address challenges and adapt the contract and adapt the principles when the situation evolved. So the only agreement that we signed later on was the development agreement. And there were other agreements which were needed, for example, the manufacturing agreement, the commercialization agreement, and we did not touch that. So actually the commercialization agreement was signed about 10 months after we started the project. And the problem was in this agreement and also in the manufacturing agreement that it was difficult to describe what we were doing on a daily basis, yeah? Because if you put that into a contract language, it appears not to fit anymore to the way how we solve the problem. Yeah? And as mentioned, the commercial interests were not a roadblock because they were not the key drivers of this project. So we simply decided that the project is a 50% cost sharing and profit sharing collaboration, and we will find out later on how to solve that in detail. I don't know. The only thing that I know is that this trust-based collaboration, yeah, was the most successful way of dealing with the project. And the project became also commercially highly attractive, yeah, at the end of the day. For me, the key question is, I strongly believe that all trust-based collaborations which would use the same type of model would be much superior than collaborations which are based on control. Yeah. So I strongly believe that trust-based interactions are the dominant way, but we don't have that because all the contractual issues that we have in our contracts are based about control. Yeah. And the question goes to you guys, how a contractual system can be built, yeah, which allows trust-based collaborations, yeah, to become, yeah, to be the usual way and not the absolute exception.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I trusted to the fact that it was actually playing. Unfortunately, I couldn't hear it inside, so I hope we haven't just gone into a void. So, okay. So you may have noted Ugor's comment, all of the contractual issues we have in our contract are based around control. Now, of course, control is not a bad thing, but actually, what I would add to that point is that they're typically based around negative aspects of control. They are full, for example, of negative incentives. They're all about the nasty things that are going to happen to you if you don't perform. There's very little in there about incentive, and there's very little actually about practical control. There isn't really any definition of problem-solving forums, for example, or joint working and how that will operate. There's nothing about formal communication protocols. Actually, all of the practical detail that you need to manage an environment of uncertainty is completely absent in most contracts. And that, of course, was demonstrated when COVID hit us, when supply chain issues hit us, that actually contracts were of very little practical use. So I think that is an important framework to appreciate that traditional contracts are not designed to manage environments of uncertainty. And actually that is recognized in quite a lot of economic theory too. Oliver Hart, who we worked with closely, and in fact was part of that same academic symposium that I just mentioned, gained the Nobel Prize for Economics back in 2016 for his work on incomplete contracts. The fact that actually contracts cannot ever anticipate every circumstance and situation, that there will always be some degree of uncertainty. But as you move across the spectrum of agreements, the extent of that uncertainty changes dramatically. And of course, particularly as you move into, for example, longer-term services or development-type contracts, development contracts, of course, at their heart, having a high degree of underpinning service involved in them, then that level of uncertainty and incompleteness grows. So what Ugur was describing to us was the way that those three partners really built a governance system to deal with the incompleteness. And of course, also recognized, what's the point of trying to put a contract in place? There's so much uncertainty. What would we be negotiating? So until you've got a sufficient level of commercial certainty, actually trying to manage that through a formal traditional contract is a complete waste of time and effort. We very much espouse that view. But we also recognize that organizations need some frameworks, some tools to help them to understand when is something actually going to be dealt with through an agile model. And this is a framework, in fact, we developed some 5 years ago now for a group of our corporate members, big international corporates, where, in fact, we got them to stop thinking about risk and to think about risk as a component of uncertainty. And you may be able to read here, but essentially the framework is based around, on the vertical axis, uncertainty around the deliverable itself. You know, how clear are we about the deliverable? What is the propensity for that to change? Could there be new technologies? Could there be new techniques? Our requirements going to alter because actually we're looking to introduce something into a relative melting pot of public service requirement or whatever it may be. And on the horizontal, uncertainty of delivery. Is this using rare skills? Is it perhaps drawing on knowledge that doesn't really exist at this point? Is it purely experimental? Is it operating in an environment where there's a fragile, uncertain supply chain? And when you think about vaccine development, well, it was obviously pretty high on both of these axes. They didn't actually know whether they could develop one, and they had no idea at that time what the underpinning resources and capabilities would need to be. For example, they certainly didn't know at that point that the Pfizer vaccine was going to have to be stored and shipped at minus 80 degrees Celsius, or the capacity that there was in the system for actually being able to support that sort of shipment and storage requirement. So obviously, as you looked at the Pfizer vaccine, it was quite clearly up there in box D. And box D is where we begin to develop and need these agile models. But of course, that is informative, it's helpful if we understand that box D represents agile, but what does it then mean? Well, actually, if you look at the typical way that organizations go around controlling projects, it's a combination of 3 elements. It's a contract, it's a relationship. I think Ugur talked about the importance of the relationship, but it's also a governance framework. And actually, what Ugur did in this situation was, yes, we've got relationship, and we're going to surround that with a clear approach to governance. Contract, that can come later when we know what we're doing, if we ever get there. And I think this is the critical point. So what we do here is we overlay the need for contract, the need for governance, and the need of relationship based upon these varying levels of uncertainty. 98% of business today is done in box A. Quite a lot of it shouldn't be in box A, but it's put there because of our wish for standards and control. But we have other models available to us too. We have performance-based contracts, we have outcome-based contracts, we have relational or collaborative contracts and alliances. And actually, what we've done here is started to plot the contracting model and the commercial model according to these levels of uncertainty, which I think probably should resonate with you from an agile point of view, because why are we using agile? Well, because there's a high degree of uncertainty. So if agile is indeed this methodology stressing the value of maximum flexibility, and while it was originally, of course, developed and has been extensively used in software engineering, but actually it applies much more broadly in an uncertain world where we need to be more adaptive. Agile techniques become something that is a critical business capability. Now, agile's inherent uncertainty, as you see the quote there, is the antithesis of the certainty that all good contract lawyers and procurement experts seek. Well, I would challenge the word good. I might say poorly informed or unimaginative, but it certainly isn't good. So we know that actually agile methodology is going to get used in situations where you are very constrained and limited in your ability to really identify scope, schedule, budget. So we need techniques and methods that can help us through. Does that mean corporates are going to feel regularly comfortable about abandoning having contracts? Well, I think not. But they do need to recognize the organizational capability that is needed to do agile. And in fairness to lawyers particularly, one of the reasons they often are hostile or hesitant about agile as a model is because they lack confidence in the capability of their organization to operate in an agile manner. And sadly, of course, they're often right to have that skepticism, because we do know that there are some very real organizational challenges in catching a bit of Mirko's earlier presentation, I think, again really emphasized that point. We need to have that ability to collaborate. Most organizations don't have that. They are built on contention systems where individual functional groups see themselves often in competition with each other, not collaboration with each other. So these prerequisites do need to be understood and addressed. We do, as an agile community, need to make sure our executives understand these requirements, at least for that program or project, because otherwise we're just setting ourselves up for failure, and we're setting up agile for a continued bad name. So be real, be realistic, understand the requirements, communicate the requirements, make sure they're in place. Don't set yourself up for failure. So, in summary, absolutely, we see a growing need for agile contracts. And we are seeing in our benchmark studies that there are growing instances of use. And we've actually recently published a paper that gives some really good advice on counsel on the components that you need in an agile contract. But often that may be that you supplement the contract with this sort of formal governance standard, or indeed that phase one of your project is covered by governance, not contract. And that as you begin to develop greater levels of certainty, then you move to contract. So we know that failure is typically due to absence of necessary capabilities and behaviors within the buying company, but obviously also we need to test and validate capability in the supplier as well. And equally understand that often a big project may have agile components, but the whole thing may not be agile. You mentioned Australia before, let's continue with Australia. Great example there, where actually a major construction project, road construction project, was undertaken or tended to be undertaken using agile techniques. And one of the reasons for that was because about 60 miles of that construction was in relatively unknown, unfriendly terrain, where they really didn't know what the consequences were going to be, what the challenges would be. The total highway being built was more like 300 miles, but they tried to do the entire thing under this agile form, which had the impact of driving up uncertainty, risk, and cost. In reality, the 240 miles of it was entirely predictable and standard. So they really needed to think about segmenting the overall project into the areas that had uncertainty versus those that had certainty. Don't introduce unnecessary complexity to the entire program if in fact it's just components. Obviously, we need to be very thoughtful about supplier capability and actively test that, look for examples, case studies where they can demonstrate this behavior, and of course, make sure that the team that's being allocated to it are familiar with working in these agile frameworks and have the authority needed to do it.